Well, hey folks, good to see you all and that you made it through lunch. You're not sleeping yet, so that's good. I'm Nick Leghorn, as you said. I work for the New York Times. Slight disclaimer, as usual, none of this information is derived from, related to the New York Times, cannot guarantee the format. Talk to your auditors, basically, is the TLDR there. I have a pet peeve as well, and that is policies that don't make sense and you can't read. Quick show of hands. How many people have actually read all of their corporate information security policies? And how many of you actually wrote those information security policies? Yeah, that's what I thought. So it's only the people who actually wrote them seem to actually read them is the problem, because they're incomprehensible. This is University of California, I forget where, but this is their information security policy, and this is the format it's presented. It is a long, drawn-out legalese document that describes exactly what you're intended to do. And the only people that can seem to read these are lawyers, and as a result, no one actually follows them, right? And it's not just information security policies, it's policies in general. A small publication called the New York Times went through and looked at 150 privacy policies, which are also intended for people to read and understand and learn from and follow, and realize that you basically need a college degree to understand what's in any of them. Like, these are services that are intended to be used by average people, that these policies are intended to inform them of what's going on and what their rights are, but they're incomprehensible. It takes hours to go through these things and a high degree of skill to understand what's actually in them. So there's a reason for this, right? There's a reason that policies are terrible. And the reason is that the policies are written for the drivers of the information security policies and the privacy policies. And the drivers are three things. There's legal obligations. So the lawyers have some requirements on how these need to work and what needs to be in things. And they're also looking at reducing legal liability. So how can we as a company insulate ourselves and make sure that we're not liable for stuff? There's compliance, right? Your compliance team has HIPAA, CCPA, GDPR, SOC 2, PCI, any number of the word soups for compliance requirements that have to be in these things. This is where the password rotation stuff comes in, because password rotation is a PCI requirement, and until it's not a PCI requirement, you can't take it out. And so that's one of the problems of just being adherent to the standards themselves. And then HR is your last driver, usually. HR wants to be able to, if someone has gone off the deep end, if someone has exported all of your user database to Pastebin, to be able to go and terminate said employee or have some disciplinary action. So they need to be able to point to chapter and verse of why this is happening. And so those are usually your drivers. And so your policy reflects what your drivers want. Legal, compliance, HR are very technical, very in-depth, very hard requirements that lead to a lengthy, complex policy that requires a legal degree to understand. But this policy, this problem isn't unique to just policies. Policies are one area that we get on a daily basis, that we run into this thing where there's a bunch of lawyers that have dictated what a thing needs to be like that we read on a daily basis. But that's not the only one. This is where being a pilot comes in. So 14 CFR 91103, pre-flight action. Within being a pilot, there are a set of regulations that you must follow. And if you don't follow them, that's how you get your license taken away. 91103 is specific to pre-flight action. And it says, each pilot in command shall, before beginning a flight, become familiar with all available information concerning that flight. The words all available information are very, very specific here. And so for airline pilots, what that means is you get a book printed out before every flight that details all available information that could possibly be pertinent in any portion of the flight. And what that results in is something that there's no way. Like there's no way that I'm gonna sit there and read the entirety of this thing before every flight or before even every day. But the problem is there's some actually important stuff in there. There's some things that actually matter. And when you skip reading it, because those things are lost in the sea of stuff you also need to learn, you get things like this, where like Allegiant takes off and flies to an airport that's closed because the closure notice was a NOTAM that was part of the packet that they got, but they didn't read. Or you get a situation where a pilot crashes because he didn't get a weather briefing. A weather briefing is a shorter version of this for private pilots that also is a giant chunk of text. And understanding all the components of it are complicated, and it takes time, and it's dense. And so finding the specific piece of information you need to accomplish your job is difficult. The FAA actually understands that this is a problem, though. Earlier this year in March, they put out this advisory circular, which is basically like a note to pilots that says, in essence, yeah, these things are terrible. Like pre-flight briefing is broken. The sea of unimportant garbage is hiding all the things you actually need to find. And it's making it so that it's an unsafe situation for pilots. And they said that they're working on fixing it. And in the meantime, kind of gave absolution for pilots who don't read the entire thing. They recommended going off and finding other sources to brief themselves on. I use an app called Garmin Pilot that highlights the specific things that I need to worry about for my flight and does that thing for me, rather than having the giant pamphlet. So other sources that are more focused, summarized, specific to the thing that I need, the information that I need in my, to accomplish my task, is what they're advising me to go do. And that's, I think, what we should do here as well with policies. So before we do that, let's go back to basics. So what is a policy and why does a policy exist, right? A policy is a statement of intent by the business of how they want employees to operate and how things should function. It's trying to set a standard, a baseline of expectations for people of how you should act. And in doing so, the output should be a risk reduction for the business. Because if everyone's doing the same thing in the same way that's been pre-approved, theoretically, the business isn't so risky. You don't have someone, if you have a policy against using password as your default password, theoretically, people won't do that anymore. And you reduce risk to the business. So in reality, we have been crafting policies to meet stakeholder requirements. We've been crafting policies to meet the lawyers' requirements. But really, we should be crafting crafting policies for employees. It should be designed in a way that employees are able to understand and read to get the information that they need quick and upfront with compliance, HR, and legal as stakeholders. They're not unimportant, but they're not the core audience that we're going for. So let's deconstruct a policy real quick, look at the parts, and try to build it a little bit better. Scope and applicability. So in a standard policy, these are the general building blocks you'll see are a scope and applicability, who needs to care, where does it apply, what employees are under it, that sort of thing. Usually also like some disciplinary action sort of thing. Objectives, what do we hope to achieve? We're hoping to do X, Y, and Z. References, PCI standards, law references, where these requirements are coming from. So you're not just saying all laptops must be pink because I like the color pink. You actually have a reference stating that I want pink laptops because PCI 2.1 says pink is the color to be. A policy statement. So you've said what the objective is. Now you say, this is the thing we actually want you to do. A statement of intent from management, how they should behave. Standards. Implementation agnostic, usually. Set of requirements around, okay, you told me what you want to do. How do I do that? How do I know that I've achieved that goal and when I've gotten to that place? And then guidelines, more implementation specific sets of requirements for how to meet the standards. So if you can think about it as like a hierarchical model, right? The objective is the large part of it. Policy statements are the specific thing you're trying to do. Standards are the set of objective statements of how you get there, implementation agnostic, and then guidelines are implementation specific. How do we get to that point? And then procedures are the last part that takes that whole thing and boils it down to step by step, here's how you achieve that. So typically how this all works, right, is the top bunch are slammed into one giant document that no one ever reads again. And then you've got a bunch of procedures that are generated by the business or engineering teams or who has it that describe what they do on a daily basis and aren't really tied to anything, right? There's no way to reference them properly, or when an audit comes up, there's no way for them to be brought into the process in a meaningful way because they're really just disjointed. There's no consistency. But what if we take all those things and we decouple them? So instead of it being one giant monolithic policy, we take those, we decouple them, and we create new things by the audience. Because really, when you boil it down, the first three are really what HR, legal, compliance, those folks care about. They care that you have scope and applicability, you have objectives, you have references. That's where they're able to go back to their auditors and say, this is why we are doing these things, this is where we got it, and make them happy. Policy statements and standards are more for upper management for, especially when you're doing kickoffs for new projects. Why are we doing this thing? What do we care about? What is the intent for this? It's more about task prioritization and just setting up expectations for why this is a thing. Guidelines are where you start getting into, okay, you've told me to go build a cloud solution that does X, Y, and Z. What does that actually mean? Guidelines are where that more general guidance comes and is more implementation specific. So where a policy might say, build a compliant AWS or build a compliant cloud instance, the guidelines would be AWS specific, GCP specific, Azure specific for how you do those sort of things. And then procedures are for specific tasks within that umbrella for the individual employee to go reference. Now, not only do they understand exactly what it is to do X, Y, and Z, they can tie that back to the guideline where it came from. They know that ties to the standard where that guideline was derived. They can understand how that flows from the top, from the scope and applicability and the objectives, all the way through the policy to their specific point. And they don't really care about the rest of the stuff, right? If I'm some L1 employee that just got hired the other day to spin up a cloud server, I have the procedure in front of me. I have the specific part of the policy that matters. I don't need to read the rest of the policy because I know that it all flows together and it has some backing to it. I have the portion that is important to me. So the way to break it down then is the first three go into what I call a policy overview. So it's a one single page document, one single document, probably multiple pages, where it talks about these things and it puts all the stuff together. This is like if you think about this like a book, right? This is the introduction. This is the opening of the book where it talks about what is going on and why the things matter. Statements and standards are where you go into details. So these are the chapters of the book. This is the meat and potatoes of what you're doing and why you're doing it. You don't need to do a new scope and applicability, objectives and references for each of these things because it's a reference, right? You have one document that sits at the top. Each policy details document references those documents. And so you only have the portions that you need. Guidelines become guidance docs and procedures become procedures. And the way you make this hierarchical, like I said, one policy overview for the whole thing. So one understanding of where these requirements are coming from, what the overall requirements are, that ties to different policy details documents of, okay, there's a network security policy coming off of this security policy. There's a cloud security policy here. Each of those has multiple guidance docs referenced under it. Each of those guidance docs have multiple procedures referenced under it. So it's a hierarchical process that flows from the top and makes sure that you isolate the portions of the policy you actually care about. So what does this look like in practice? So this is what a policy overview would look like. And the best way I've seen to actually implement this is if you put this, I want to make a note here, right? the best way to display this stuff is on a web page of some sort, right? We're all remote these days. We're all in tech companies probably. We're dealing with people who have used a website before. Displaying the stuff on a website makes the most sense. Having a linked note from page to page allows you to have that tie from each page to the next one. It allows you to link back up. So at the top there, if it says Information Security Policies Overview, that could be a single document you write once. And you don't have to worry about updating it for every single one or duplicating it or having a portion that people skip around on. If you really want to read it, go for it. It's up there. But the thing that you really care about is what's on the page there. And so creating something like this, where there's an overview page that links to all the policies and has a quick hit, a single sentence that clearly describes what each policy is doing and why it exists, is critical, right? Because that gives us the ability to hand this page to a new employee. They're able to scan it really quickly, understand the gist of, okay, there's these policies that say these things. And if I need more information, I now know exactly where I need to go. I don't have to read the whole thing to understand what it's asking. I know that there's more information in there if my job requires me to do these things. But if I, as a network engineer, don't need to touch servers at any point in time, I don't need to understand the system hardening guideline. It's not something I need to read. So you don't have to force me to read the entire information security policy to get there. So it's easy to read, easy to see, understandable. And like I said, I'm making a note here that the easiest way to read it as an employee is in a website format, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the auditors like that format, right? So if you create policies like this, having a printed version of it is really the best way to do it. You can just roll it into a single PDF. You just have all these pages zipped up into one big binder, and that usually satisfies the requirements. They don't really care. They don't care how big it is, they just care that the content is there. And so if you have a lot of these extra navigation stuff in there, it doesn't really matter to them. Policy details page. So once you get to the point where you say, okay, we have a network security policy, we are going to do these things. We shall ensure that all data and systems on our network are appropriately secured, right? That's the intent, that's the policy that we're saying. How do you know that you've gotten there? A policy and standards are supposed to be implementation agnostic. So if you take a look, the bullet points here, all connections must be encrypted. Doesn't say SSL, doesn't say VPN, doesn't say have to have an F5 load balancer in there with an APM. That's the standard, is you have encryption of some sort. And then underneath that, you can link to, okay, what does that actually mean for the thing I'm trying to do? So if I have a SaaS application, how do I secure that with appropriate encryption? Or if I'm pulling up a GCP system, how do I turn that on and make sure that it's enforced all the time? So this is direct, actionable, implementation agnostic things. If I'm going out and setting up a new system, I know what my expectations are. If it's as an application security engineer, as a developer, I now understand what the AppSec people are going to be looking for. I know what the requirements are, the checklist looks like for setting up my new system before I've even flipped a single switch. So this is great for quickly providing requirements to teams and a great quick reference sheet for just making sure you've hit all the things. And then guidance docs are really where we get into meat and potatoes of what do you expect? So when you're setting up, so this one is like a secure application development guideline, right? So for this sort of a document, what I would expect to be in here would be like, okay, here's a template of what it looks like to set up a Go application in a secure way. Here's what a good Terraform document looks like for setting up your environment. What does the paved road look like? And how do I follow that paved road? So we've gone from implementation agnostic, where it just needs to be encrypted, needs to be secured, needs to do these things, to specifically, this is how you do that. This is what the paved road looks like. So if you are just an engineer who needs this information, this is all you need to do to go to. This is the only document that you need to reference. You don't need to look at the rest of the security policy to understand what's in it. So benefits. So what we just talked through, right, is a way of breaking up and deconstructing much like the highly paid chefs downtown in Austin do when they deconstruct like a cheesecake or something. We've deconstructed what a policy is. We've taken the parts and the components. We've figured out a little bit better what components are for what audiences. And we've thought about what do we put in each document and where does it go and how does it work? So there's a couple benefits to this. The big one, as a former person who ran a GRC team, is that it's decoupled. So now every time I go and update one component of the security policy, I don't need to go and revalidate to the security policy. If I want to change that I'm no longer requiring password rotation every 90 days, I only have to update the password rotation part of the policy, and that's the only document that changes. I don't need to touch the overview. I don't need to touch anything else. I just have specific stakeholders for that little document, and that's all that changes, which makes my life a lot easier. Common components are reused and referenced on each page, so you can move up and down the chain. If you want to look at, if you really care about what the references are, you can go and look at it, but as 90% of the employees will never do that, you don't have to burden them with that kind of information. And the documents can be compiled for auditors, especially putting it in a format like this actually somehow or somewhat makes it a little bit better. Like it's going to make the policy document look bigger because it's going to be a bigger book of stuff. But because you have clearly defined where the requirements are for each specific section, auditors will now know where to go to look for those things. So it makes it a lot easier for them to come in and just check the box that, yep, I've got that section in there. That's all good to go. In terms of usability and comprehension, only the necessary information at the appropriate level of resolution is there. So if I walk into a meeting with a bunch of C-level executives, I can whip out that high level, here are just the basic requirements of what we need. I don't need to give them the guidance document, the procedure document, that stuff they don't care about, right? I'm slicing it to just the stuff that they need to see. Links to further documentation, and can be used as a checklist. So now that we have the requirements clearly defined, we know what the expectations are, you can use that as your checklist to figure out how do you do these things. So this isn't the end, right? Just slicing out your stuff into different documents isn't the end all be all of creating good policies and good stuff, right? The format doesn't really matter if your content is terrible. So ways to write better policies that I've found. Keeping policy standards short, readable, and implementation agnostic is critical. If you write a policy that states you must use a GCP function that Google then deprecates, then your policy is basically useless, and people have to violate your policy to actually do things. So if you keep all of your policies at a high level where it's implementation agnostic, you don't care whether you're using GCP, AWS, whatever, some OpenStack cloud that you created internally, doesn't matter. As long as you're meeting the requirements, that's really what matters. And that's really what good security is meeting the requirements and expectations. Once you've got that stuff written down and figured out, making sure you have appropriate management buy-in for policies. Not just going ahead and like slamming in an information security policy because your auditors say you have to do it, but actually talking to the right people, talking to the engineering teams to make sure that they're on board with these changes and these are actually supportable. And then a good thing to do is to actually make sure you're tying each of your policy requirements to specific controls. So even if you're just using PCI, CIS 20, OWASP top 10, like those handful of high-level things, you can pretty well tie a lot of your information security policies directly back to those. It's a lot of help when you're fighting with engineering teams or users who say, I don't want to do a thing, to be able to tie directly back to this is why we're saying it. We're not saying it because we're the bad guys. We're not saying this is a policy requirement because we feel like it's a good idea. We're saying this is a policy requirement because X, Y, and Z standard says this is how it happens. And this is what happens for that. So it's, so things to work for that. Regulatory frameworks work well, HIPAA, GDPR, CCPA, PCI, whatever. Industry standards are great backups. If there's something that doesn't fit those other things, having even just a list of risks that you're reducing, and being able to tie those policy requirements to the risk that you're talking about will let you have that discussion a little bit better. We don't allow VPN. We don't allow people to connect to the data center without a VPN because this is a risk we've identified on our register and we're not doing it. It's a lot better conversation than we're not going to let you do it because we don't want to. Making your guidelines useful is also really important. Making sure your documentation actually matches your environment. A lot of policies are written once and put on a shelf. So making sure you go back and update your policies and your guidance documents to make sure that they actually meet what you're doing. If you've just shifted from an on-prem deployment to a cloud deployment, going in and updating those things is super important. Providing useful information for engineers is one of the big ones. So this, one of the nice things about creating good documentation and good policies in this way is that you're able to tell engineers that information is in the policy. You should read the policy. This is a thing that you should go do because it trains them that everything is in the policy. So if the policy is useful and they'll actually go read the policy, they'll more likely go back to the policy rather than bugging you in the first case, and will consistently follow the policy because it's written out there. So making it useful means that they actually get something out of it. They're actually going to read it rather than just ignoring it. Making sure you have paved roads. So if you don't have a template for how to stand up a GCP environment, or if you don't have a code example for how to set up a Go environment, or what a standard application would look like, providing a paved road allows you to point to those things that already exist. So you're able to give the developers a starting space that already is compliant. So rather than having to guess at will this or will this be okay, having them start from that framework allows them to be able to riff on it and start to develop and actually build useful things rather than having to go back to the security requirements every single time and figure out if it's okay or not. And then reaching out, adding a way to reach out for questions. I like including an FAQ section on my policy documents that gets constantly updated with just things that are coming up all the time. And it's a good way to not only make sure the questions that are getting asked a lot are getting answered in a consistent way, but it's a way to keep yourself honest. If you've said X, Y, and Z is banned, or we want to do this way instead, having a documented place where you've answered that question before allows you to make sure you're consistent in how you apply it. So you're not just spouting out stuff when you think it's a good idea off the cuff. You actually have a consistent answer to things. This is really it. This is the key. Like I'm not gonna lie, it's a super short presentation because I think it's a pretty simple concept that you should be providing the right information at the right level of detail to the appropriate audience. And that's what policies have been missing for the last ever, right? We write them for lawyers because lawyers ask us for them and auditors ask us for them, but we don't write them for security or for engineers. We don't write them for employees. And as a result, when an employee actually has to use it, it's a cluster. It just doesn't work. So this is my format that I use for writing policies to make sure that they're in bite-sized chunks. I found it works pretty well. And I think as long as you follow the principle of just making sure that you're writing to the audience that you're expecting and not your auditors, it's just a better solution. So the nice thing is, if you're chunking all these things into individual documents, right, you're able to change and rev one specific portion of the document. You don't have to rev the entire thing. So you can actually put all of your policies into Git and have it all sourced there. Especially there's a way to, there's some templates where you can like automatically create pages in GCP and websites based on a Git repo that pushes there. Super easy to do. So even if you just do it that way, where you just rev things in Git and you just have a web page that has all the information in it, super easy to maintain. The more complicated thing that you might be asking about is like, how do you ensure that the approval is there for the right document at the right place? Having, for each document, having a set of stakeholders, even if it's just teams, that is important for that document. And it doesn't have to be every stakeholder for every document, right? HR might want to be a stakeholder for everything. Legal probably wants their fingers in all the pies, but the engineering team probably doesn't really care about like desktop hardening requirements. So making sure you keep, at least at a team level, responsible for signing off on these specific changes helps you cut down the number of people that actually have to do anything on it and enables you actually to publish things quicker. One nice way of handling those sort of things is making a distinction between policy, like a formal policy. So policy overview, policy details, standards, and guidance documents. Having those set up and described as like, these are the official documents, right? These are the things that we actually publish and we send out to our auditors. Typically, you won't really give like procedure documents or sub-documents to an auditor unless they really ask for it. At that point, there's an understanding that this isn't really part of the policy. Like this is an implementation of the policy you've put out. So giving the FAQ document that level of understanding, that this is an interpretation of the policy, this is a sub-document off of it, but this is not the legal policy, helps them differentiate those things. Like you can still roll it up, you can still see how it derives from the rest of it, but it doesn't give it that same, it gives them some wiggle room. Like if I've said something in the FAQ that's wrong, I have the ability to go back and edit that because it's not officially part of the policy. One of my previous bosses, who Doug is going to laugh at, once told me he wants the policy to be no longer than one sentence. And I struggled with that for a while until I realized that he was actually right. Like the policy statement itself is supposed to be one sentence that you can understand what is implied by the rest of it. And so when I do attestations, or like when my suggestion for doing attestations to the GRC team that we have is to attest to this. This is the page that says, these are all the policies that exist. These are all the things that are out there. This is a high level understanding of what there is. I don't expect that an engineer would sit there and read all 130 pages of whatever UC Santa Clara's policy is. I wouldn't expect you to go and read that. Like I think it's a reasonable understanding that, you know, this is a one-page thing. You understand what's in there. And that's a more useful piece of information, that I understand where the location is to get this if I need it, rather than having them read the literal thing. All right, folks. Well, I appreciate it.